So in this video, we'll be taking a deep dive look into Rise within the context of the Japanese idol industry, and how her inclusion in Persona 4, a game released in 2008, highlights a shift in entertainment that's more relevant than ever 15 years later. We'll also go over why the investigation team's inclusion in Rise's performances aren't as outlandish as they appear. Hey guys, I'm Lady, and as someone of Japanese heritage, I find much purpose and enjoyment in breaking down the cultural influences of the modern Persona games, so be sure to check out my other analyses. But without further ado, let's peel back the curtain on Rise Kujikawa. So many of you may be wondering, how realistic is it for some ordinary girl from way out in the boonies to even become an idol? Well, in Japan, it's actually not as rare as you might think. The industry actually keeps an eye out for such opportunities in the form of local idols, a shift in approach that was quickly normalized following the huge success of AKB48's 2005 debut and the dawn of the internet age. But before we really get into this local idol topic and its connection to Rise and Inaba, I'd like to go over the relevant background of the industry first. So, the origin of Japanese idols stems all the way back to the 60s. In the decades following, numerous all-male and all-female idol groups launched and enjoyed significant popularity, all until the economy came crashing down in the early 90s. Interest in idols dwindled for most of that decade, though there was a brief resurgence with Morning Musume's debut in 1997. But overall, things were not looking good for the industry until 2005, when the launch of AKB48 legit changed everything. Producer Yasushi Akimoto's foundational vision for this girl group was based all around this concept of idols you can meet. Meaning the biggest appeal of these idols would be the meet and greet, or in modern terms, parasocial-like quality they could build with their fans. Idol industry management of previous decades would normally keep their talent out of the public eye, much like the typical celebrities from all around the world until social media. And so, unlike the stars of old that seemed so out of reach to the average person, the AKB48 girls would come from ordinary families and would be deliberately marketed as this down-to-earth, friendly image. In other words, the girl next door, complete with tons more fan interaction. Handshake events with fans to this day make up a huge proportion of the overall revenue for these talent agencies, referred to collectively as the Jimusho. Tickets to these events are obtained by purchasing a physical CD, and each ticket provides about 10 seconds of fan interaction, though more time is generally permitted to fans who have obtained multiple tickets from multiple purchases. Unfortunately, it's commonplace for the Jimusho to take an unjustified cut of these stars' earnings, not to mention the dominance and control they have over these idols. But these things will be in their own main topic later in the video. To continue off this socialization aspect with fans though, this is actually incredibly relevant to Rise's own personal backstory. In rank 5 of her social link, she says she used to be so shy and even reveals she'd been bullied. But by stepping outside of her comfort zone via taking the idol position she's offered, even though she's never imagined herself as one, and we can definitely see a marked change. How she just exudes confidence by the time we meet her in Persona 4. Sure, sheer exposure to a ton of different people isn't going to work for everybody, and I don't mean to make light of the difficulties conditions like social anxiety can cause. I feel like I can relate to Rise's experience here though, because long story short, I was also a really shy kid in early elementary school. But the opportunities I was blessed to have and also capitalize on helped me become someone who's comfortable meeting and getting to know strangers as I grew older. In a similar light, I like to think all the meet and greet events Rise had to do helped her break out of her shell. We see from first introductions at her grandma's tofu shop that deep down, she really is just a naturally warm and friendly girl. And even though Kanji puts Yosuke on the spot right in front of Rise, hell, Yosuke even embarrasses himself, yet Rise is able to put him and everyone at ease. She's also incredibly thoughtful, throwing in extra tofu as thanks for worrying about her. We see more of this outgoing nature as the game progresses, like when she calls Kanji by his first name despite only just joining the group, something that's only reserved for close friends and family. She's also a great communicator, shown via her rousing pep talks and mini-speeches at various points in the game, from encouraging everyone before the Junez concert to calming everyone down during the heated Namatame situation. Not to mention how she really does just love to be in the spotlight. We'll go over all these things more thoroughly once we get to her social link, but overall, the main point I'm getting at here is that the Rise we meet in Persona 4 is a far cry from the shy girl she says she used to be. In other words, she's always had this charismatic potential that the idol agencies are looking for, an ability to connect with others and make them gravitate towards her. She just needed that outside push to nurture it. Now, seeing how literally all my videos are uploaded on YouTube, I should probably address the elephant in the room and point out the similarities for what they are here, right? I mean, this platform and AKB48 even launched in the exact same year. So what I'm getting at is that the major appeal of most early YouTubers was that all these folks were just regular people filming from their bedroom. This personality-driven quality has only exploded with all the other social media platforms since then, and it's this exact relatable feel that the modern Japanese idol industry has been shooting for, though obviously the thing separating these individual YouTubers from the Japanese approach is how all this idol talent, at the end of the day, is under one giant corporate thumb, which we'll get into more later. But nevertheless, it's this amateurish feel that separates Japanese idols from their K-pop counterparts, and even from the assumptions I've seen some Westerners make, that Japanese idols are just like any other pop singer/songwriter from their home country, someone like a Lady Gaga or Adele or Beyonce. I definitely can't fault anyone for making this assumption, since it's kinda hard to name any Western equivalent to the Japanese idol industry. I guess the closest thing would be the child actors who star on the traditionally kid/family-friendly channels like Disney or Nickelodeon. Many of these stars have had a few singles, if not albums, released while their show was airing, though most struggle to become successful solo artists afterwards. And if they do, it's usually after years of not being taken seriously by the public, nor their professional peers. This leads us to how Japanese idols, especially since Morning Musume's time, have developed this reputation of being subpar at best when it comes to actual singing and dancing talent. Since charisma and personality above all else is meant to be their selling point, and looks definitely play a big role as well, it means there are quite a number of fans who don't even care about the music that much. They'll just buy the albums to support their favorite idol, since ultimately these idols are meant to sell dreams, or in other words, provide an encouraging escape from the difficulties of everyday life. This means they don't necessarily need to have exceptional talent in singing and/or dancing. In all actuality, this is another huge aspect of their appeal. Unlike the beyond perfect vocal abilities and musicianship of the traditional singers and songwriters, who are referred to as artists in comparison, the Japanese public typically expects idols to be amateurs. This allows the idols to sell this journey aspect of watching them hone their craft and mature over time. I mean, it's even become tradition for the final send-off where an idol either leaves a group or the industry altogether to be marketed as their graduation. Again, the producer of AKB48 says himself, these girls are intentionally marketed as a mediocre and unfinished product. So yes, there's a clear distinction between the terms idol and artist as they've been understood in Japan since the 90s. The latter are those who have entered the industry with a professional level of skill in their given craft, oftentimes having had classical training in it, whether it be singing, dancing, acting, etc. Artists, first and foremost, want to build their career and livelihood off the merits of their own creations and skill, not some likability factor, which is why the idol label is avoided like the plague by any Japanese artists, including non-idol pop groups like Flower, for instance, who want their work to be taken seriously by the public. This entire perception is why Yusuke from Persona 5 takes such offense to Kawanabe's talent agency's offer, which I'll cover more of in the next section of the video. But back to Japanese idols, I want to make it absolutely clear that I'm not saying they are completely talentless or that they don't work hard. Idol and skill don't have to be mutually exclusive concepts, and it's clear they need to meet a certain threshold to carry a performance on stage. It's just that Japanese idol music itself is usually niche bubblegum pop, stuff that's not very technically difficult when it comes to music theory, vocals, or dance choreography, so it's pretty easy for anyone to sing and dance along to. Now, if you'd allow me to speak from some personal experience, I've spent nearly 15 years performing live and competing with various kinds of ensembles, 1 year of which we won a Grammy Signature Award together. So in other words, I know what to look for on a technical level, and having combed through a ton of these idols' live performances for this video, I can definitely say the average group has a lot of skill issue. Now, to be fair, I completely acknowledge how much hard work goes into developing the steady breath support required to sing and dance at the same time, having done marching band and later on something akin to show choir myself. Nevertheless, there wasn't much musicality, or in other words, expression, behind the average idol singing, such as proper phrasing, use of dynamics, or vibrato where appropriate. But all of this combined is why I think the Junes concert plays off this amateur expectation so well. Like, obviously it's still exaggerated since there's absolutely no way Chie and Yukiko developed any kind of embouchure that allowed them to play trumpet and sax in just a couple days. And yes, the recording itself sounds great, but lore-wise, a Japanese audience probably wasn't expecting perfection. Remember, many fans actually prefer seeing their favorite idol's growth process, which also makes the premise of the dancing game not as outlandish as it seems at first glance. You know, with Rise just casually having all her friends from Inaba join her as backup dancers despite them having no prior experience. Plus, Inoue-san having the entire crew share their individual goals to the camera in the lead-up to the performance just captures this normalized aspect of seeing the growth of these stars. Additionally, in real life, it's not uncommon for Japanese idols to make their official public debut after only a single month of proper training. But it's this very idol aesthetic that fits so perfectly with Persona 4's coming-of-age themes, with Rise even reminding us not to worry about getting everything right. Ultimately, the crowd is there to have fun, so they as idols need to have fun first. A vibe that is in complete contrast to the performance quality expected from the K-pop idol industry. I truly think you'll find this relevant and interesting since, number one, the blueprint for these groups originates from the Japanese idol industry. 2, K-pop is an international sensation now, so in turn, people might make misguided assumptions about Japanese idols. And 3, It was a big part of my adolescence, having grown up in a school district with a ton of Asians, so sit your butt down, folks. You have the pleasure of listening to me talk about this, okay? So by K-pop idols, I'm referring to the girl and boy groups that are signed to an entertainment agency. Unlike most Japanese idols, it's the norm for aspiring K-idols to go through an incredibly rigorous training period, normally for multiple years before they make any official debut, and that's only if a trainee even makes the actual cut in the end. I mean, this video I linked below on the last guy to be cut from BTS before the group went public is just one example. Korea has a much smaller population than Japan, and therefore a much smaller domestic market. So as a result, there's a big need to tap into overseas ones, meaning their stars have to be able to compete with the legit professionals of foreign industries. K-pop agencies even hire global heavyweights like Keone Madrid to choreograph dance numbers, like BTS's Dope, for example. And in general, shooting for international markets explains the steady hip-hop influence throughout, given how that and R&B elements have been incorporated into global pop since the late 90s. In contrast, Japan has a large enough market at home. In fact, it boasts the largest domestic music market in the world, just behind the US, which is why they only focus on appealing to the Japanese audience. This also unfortunately puts the Japan-only nature of most Atlas events in better context, right guys? Anyway, to wrap up this cultural difference between the J-idol and K-idol industries, there was a show from 2018 called Produce 48, starring members from AKB48, their sister groups, and K-pop trainees. The competition was supposed to narrow down the contestants in order to launch a joint Japanese and Korean idol group, and it was quite the culture shock for the Japanese girls. Most were judged as terribly basic in terms of their singing and dancing ability. Their scores in these areas frequently dismal compared to the Korean girls. However, when it came to audience interaction and doing interviews, this is where the Japanese idols truly excelled. Understandable, since these were the things expected of them from their talent agencies and society back home. Now, this isn't to say that K-idols don't get better at fan meets once they've debuted, since they've taken inspiration from the J-idol industry's monetization practices, and also hold numerous high-five and handshake events, with tickets most commonly obtained the same way, via CD purchases. So even though the Korean idols are generally better in the performance arts, they're still marketed with this down-to-earth charm. But on that note, we can finally circle back to the topic of local idols in Japan. Local idols work within their prefecture or city with the goal of promoting prefectural staples and assisting in the revival of the region. One example is Ringo Musume of Aomori Prefecture. Originally formed in the year 2000, Ringo means apple, and Musume, daughter. So as the name implies, this group promotes the apples of the region. Negiko of Niigata Prefecture is another example. Formed in 2003, they've helped promote the local onions. These idols often work with their region's tourism board and are involved in many local events in the hopes of attracting tourists to come and visit. Though encouraging tourism isn't the only goal. You see, local idols also form strong relationships to their respective communities since, they're a, quote, local. Which brings me to Rise's family business, Marukyu Tofu. Maybe it's considered a prefectural staple of Inaba? Like, as I mentioned in my Yukiko video, the Amagi Inn did serve it to guests. And let's dive even further down the conspiracy rabbit hole. So, Inaba was inspired by the real-life town of Fuefuki, which happens to be the largest producer of grapes and peaches in all of Japan. So even though Marukyu has more to do with soybeans instead, it sure is interesting that Rise is an idol from a fictional town based on a real-life one that's known for its prefectural specialties. Anyway, I think within Japanese context, it's fair to assume Rise's agency would have been happy if she was popular with just the local Inaba netizens, on top of being good promo for the region. Though hey, they couldn't have foreseen she'd have such national popularity to the point that she'd become the poster girl of the talent agency. But for the average idol, since the public doesn't expect too much from them, it actually allows for so many fun and zany groups that simply couldn't exist otherwise. Take Osaka Oba-chan, for example. These ladies are legit my favorite group I've stumbled across while researching for this video. I wish I could play parts of the song alongside this video footage, but in my experience, YouTube's Content ID system is way more strict with audio than with visuals, and I've been demonetized before for including just a handful of seconds, so I'm not gonna risk it. Shameless plug though, if you like my videos and want to support what I do, consider joining my Patreon. Anyway, you owe it to yourself to check out the unironically amazing Osaka Oba-chans. Now, there have been real-life instances of local idols who were propelled to mainstream success. For one, Perfume started out as a local idol group from Hiroshima in 2002, but were so popular they were signed to a major label just 3 years later in 2005. Popular actress Kanna Hashimoto also started out in a local idol group before shooting to nationwide fame in 2013. Rise is portrayed in a similar light. Her manager truly thinks she has a natural aptitude for the entertainment sphere, a semblance of effortlessness her peers could only dream of. But speaking of those things, it's about time we finally move on to Rise's shadow, her social link, and the Jimusho's ironclad grip over the entire entertainment industry. Rise's main struggles have less to do with being an entertainer in and of itself, and instead are more a result of the Jimusho's operations. How she feels like Risette is just a manufactured personality, and that she doesn't have the freedom to express her real self. I mean, the night her shadow appears on the Midnight Channel, it says it's gonna, quote, push the limits of standards and practices and bear it all. This phrase is significant in two main ways when combined with the strip club and pole dancer aesthetic of her dungeon. The first is symbolically bearing it all when it comes to her real personality and feelings, and secondly, that natural personality in and of itself is more mature than the kawaii, or cute in Japanese, vibe that talent agencies normally expect of their female idols. So let's start by addressing that first point, the standards and practices of the Jimusho. You know how I talked about both Japanese and Korean idol agencies having auditions and training periods for future stars before they debut? Well, this kind of scouting and initial investment is basically unheard of in Western entertainment, right? Artists here are expected to prove themselves before getting any kind of offer from a record label. But the beneficial trade-off for these artists is that they build up their audience from scratch, so they normally get to steer the direction of their art, personal image, and target audience all of their own accord. Some of you may be wondering about shows like American Idol or The Voice, but I think it says a lot that hardly any of the winners or top contestants go on to have success in the entertainment industry. Now, since the Jimusho puts this upfront investment into an idol, they'll definitely be expecting a return. First off, agencies make sure there's room in the market for any particular kind of idol group, as well as the individual idols themselves. For example, one might be marketed with a more rock/alternative image, while another may have a more sophisticated Ojo-sama feel. Those of you who've played the Persona 4 dancing game may remember how every girl in Kanami Kitchen had some overt aesthetic that differentiated each of them from the others in the group, even if it was a bit exaggerated. The Jimusho is part of a collective that includes other creative industries such as film, television, essentially everything having to do with the distribution of pop culture and media in Japan, which includes traditional art. As per Yusuke's confidant in Persona 5, Kawanabe's agency wishes to craft him as the handsome tragic artist, and even says, "A story like yours will sell even to those who don't understand art." As for Rise herself, she complains about having to play up the airheaded and ditzy image when her portrayal in the main story, and even her persona's abilities, demonstrate how she's much more intelligent than her entertainment persona would have you think. More on that in a bit, but to return to the general standards placed on an idol's personality, regardless of their supposed quote-unquote gimmick, the one thing they all have in common is that they are meant to come off as nice and pleasant people. Common restrictions across the board include not being able to smoke or drink in public even after they reach legal age. Japanese society values the orderly and polite. And remember how we went over the idol's main objective, to sell dreams, earlier? These groups are meant to provide an escape from all the unpleasant and dreadful things found in everyday life. As a result of all this, these stars are viewed as role models by the public, which further reinforces the Jimusho's tight control over the idols' personal lives and image. Additionally, since idols are largely marketed for their personality/charisma, this makes them suitable as regular TV personalities and guests on variety shows, and even hosts of their own talk shows once they graduate from the idol business. Though only the top idols get to benefit from this, of course, becoming some of the most recognizable faces in Japanese media. And since anywhere from 50 to 70% of Japanese TV ads feature a celebrity, versus the worldwide average of just 20%, popular idols are often the stars of their own TV spots. Revenue from advertising is incredibly lucrative for talent agencies, and gives them further incentive to control their stars' lives to make sure they remain advertiser-friendly. I know TV advertising may not seem as relevant anymore in the 2020s, but it's important to remember that Persona 4 released in 2008 and is set in 2011. You know, back when the internet, social media, and streaming platforms have yet to really take over our entire lives, meaning Rise's experience is relevant for the time. Persona 4's opening cutscene makes sure to include her Calorie Magic ad, and later it airs again during the broadcast of Rise's interview with the press.
"I'm tired of diets. Enough with going to the gym. Good thing there's something even I can handle."
But now we can segue into the most notorious restriction, and that's how idols are forbidden from pursuing romantic relationships. Back in 2013, a tabloid newspaper published photos of Minami Minagishi, a then member of AKB48, with her boyfriend Alan Shirahama. A few hours later, she released a video of herself sobbing and begging for forgiveness with her hair completely shaved off. AKB48 management even demoted her to a trainee group and apologized on her behalf and how her actions caused such a nuisance for fans. That's just completely bonkers, right? Beyond degrading and inhumane. This particular event may have occurred years after the original Persona 4's release, but the reality of the industry remains the same. Even back in the 90s, the girls of Morning Musume were forbidden from having boyfriends as per their contracts. So if you actually listen to the music that producers make for these idols, you'll find they often revolve around love and relationships, and yet displaying anything resembling those kinds of feelings beyond an innocent schoolgirl crush is a huge no-no in public and will be punished. We already talked a lot about the handshake events and the parasocial aspect that's defined 21st century idol culture, which has led to a substantial portion of the audience demographic, especially when it comes to financial support of older men, some who feel entitled to these idols' love. The agency higher-ups want their stars to retain this pure and untainted image so as to appear available to the most obsessed fans who continue to buy CDs for the special event tickets, not to mention the other merchandise. Again, agencies can't rely on these idols' musical merit alone since most aren't trained and marketed that way in the first place. So depending on the kinds of products sold, it becomes this vicious cycle where idols need fans to purchase the additional items to send the message to agencies that they are profitable. Otherwise, idols can be dropped and or groups disbanded. Rise getting mad at Teddy for purchasing another idol's photo plays into this, and considering how Kanami also gets a ton of individual merchandise while her co-stars don't, just furthers this narrative of how idols who sell get pushed to the top in the industry and vice versa. Now I do want to acknowledge the huge elephant in the room, and that's how young these girls are. How most of them, especially when they debut, are still minors. With that said, it is disingenuous to say these girls' only fans are men twice their age, since there are many people who like watching them on TV and listening to songs without going to events. And beyond some of the romantic subtext, the overall messages of many of these tracks are uplifting and relatable to anyone, regardless of background. But nevertheless, the way these girls are promoted can be dangerous. It is creepy how Rise alludes to the dolls being sold of her as not technically for kids when you suggest getting one for Nanako. Now, it's my absolute intent to give this topic the care and respect it deserves, so I'm breaking this down into two main sections. First, the portrayal of Rise to her fellow peers in the main story, or aka within the game universe. And secondly, the reality of real-life idol groups and how Rise's portrayal can be seen as a sort of wish fulfillment for some adult-aged otaku. So let's start with how Rise is written and portrayed as she lives her life with her same-age teen friends in Inaba. The real-life dating restrictions put Rise's possible relationship with the protag in a significantly new light. But Rise's lighthearted flirtatiousness goes beyond just the MC. Sure, she only shows true interest in you, but numerous times she playfully teases all the guys as a single group, saying things like this.
Don't worry, I'll let you have a taste. Ooh, or maybe I could spoon feed you.
Rise even gives an entire little speech about how they should pair up during the summer festival, but it's not just her romantic forwardness that sets her apart, but the way she embraces her body and personal appeal in general. Unlike An in certain parts of Persona 5's main story, Rise's forward sensuality is always depicted as being on her own terms. There are no unequal power imbalances or anyone in a position of authority coercing her during the events of Persona 4. She herself never appears shy or uncomfortable in situations like the beach scene or the beauty pageant. In fact, she looks forward to these occasions. Compared to the flustered Chie or the shy Yukiko, Rise confidently struts out in her bikini saying things like, "Oh, did we keep you waiting?" She even gets irked that Kanji isn't getting a nosebleed over her, since she's definitely heard about the infamous school camping trip. There are definitely questionable and even problematic depictions in P4, and I don't mean to diminish those. But the negatives shouldn't completely invalidate the positive messages in the game, in this case regarding female sexuality. Later, when the girls find out they were signed up for the school pageant, Rise simply smiles and asks Yosuke if he wants to see them on stage. And when they're told there's a surprise swimsuit section at said pageant, she responds with genuine disappointment that she didn't bring her own swimsuit. Not to mention how she purposefully plays up her charm and appeal during the actual competition itself. And her shadow, which is supposed to represent the part of her she's most ashamed about showing to others, in and of itself is overtly suggestive in its pole dancer design, dialogue, and battle animations. That is all to say, Rise is consistently, and I repeat, consistently written as confident in her body and sensuality. It's portrayed as part of her natural self when not restricted under the Jimusho. So back in my Yukiko and Chie video, I talked about how Persona 4 handles the girls' relationships with each other remarkably well, how they're not portrayed as catty and putting each other down in a not like other girls way, but instead as lifting each other up. Chie and Yukiko don't ever ridicule or demean Rise for being so openly flirty. Rise herself is competitive for attention, but always in a playful, never truly serious way. She at least never puts down other women for beating her, like when Naoto wins the pageant. She just shrugs it off and doesn't say anything bad about Naoto's more androgynous appeal. This solidarity is all the more essential when women face the same misogynistic double standard of maintaining this pure, untainted, and virginal appearance, and yet at the same time needing to be attractive enough for men. Excuse me, can't women just present themselves as they wish? Rise is proud of her figure, her body, her looks, everything. She mentions numerous times how she wouldn't be able to eat certain things if it wasn't for her hiatus from idoldom. She's also a dancer and needs to physically condition her body to perform for hours on stage. In other words, it's a lot of hard work that she takes pride in. As recently as the late 2010s, women in Japan and around the world have been sharing experiences of being slut-shamed from men and women alike, simply for what they wear to ordinary places like work and the gym. It brings to mind all the public backlash and ridicule Britney Spears endured in the late 90s and early 2000s, even though she herself has claimed the concepts in her music video as her own. Around that same time in Japan, a number of Morning Musume and Hello Project idols were humiliated and punished for simply dating. This context is what makes Rise's portrayal in P4 all the more significant to me, and I have a bit more to add to this topic, but I'd like to save it for the final section of this video that's focused on the dancing game. But with a more charitable view of this covered, let's move on to the second point I mentioned earlier, the more nefarious interpretation of all this. That this portrayal of teen idol Rise was meant to cater to a more seedy audience of players. There's a big difference between relationships among fellow teens and, well, everything else. To preface this section, I think the vast majority of players do separate reality from fiction, that the Persona games are coming-of-age stories about adolescence, so we view the dating sim aspect from the perspective of, if I was the high school age protagonist, who would I go for? Not literally, wow, I get to perv on underage girls! But the reality is, many idols are underage, yet they have suggestive pinups of themselves being taken and sold for profit. Some of these even making it into Gravure magazines. Even in-game, there's gossip of Moroka buying Rise's pinup book. Look, I don't think it's right to assume every older man who is a fan of idols has some heinous intent in mind. It's absolutely fine to be encouraged by these stars and want to support their livelihoods by buying CDs. But buying and distributing pinup photos of these real-life girls? That's where we cross the line into sexual exploitation, especially considering the laxness of Japanese laws and child P-word, since the possession of such wasn't even made illegal until 2014. Biopsychosocial research of adolescents point to teens having reduced long-term decision-making capability and limited lived experience, resulting in a skewed understanding of their commodified sexualization and its consequences. Minors, aka children, don't have the capacity to consent to their bodies being used in these ways. So not to take away from Rise's naturally flirty charm, nor her personal agency, but given the not uncommon practices in this industry, her involvement from such an early age no doubt has had an influence on how she views body image and sexuality. She's still just a kid, as is highlighted in some of her particularly immature moments, which we'll get to shortly. But this brings me to how indefensible it is that some agencies publish these girls' measurements. For management to make this public is such a gross invasion of privacy for anyone, but especially impressionable teens. And as I went over in all my Persona 5 analyses, there's a huge power imbalance between minors and adults in East Asian societies, in large part due to Confucian values of filial piety. These things are related to blacklisting by the Jimusho, one of the most infamous cases having to do with Johnny Kitagawa, who's credited as the founder of the entire idol industry. If you've heard of Johnny's and Associates, the largest agency for male idols by far, that was his brainchild. But he's been accused of SAing and grooming a number of these boys in dormitory-style housing, crimes that have held up in court. It's actually been an open secret in the industry for decades now. In recent years, the company has even filed a lawsuit against the latest victim to speak out, Koan Okamoto. So yeah, Yusuke's last name is definitely a low-key call-out. Real-life Kitagawa died in 2019, but he and his agency wielded such massive influence in the space that no major Japanese television network has reported anything on it to this day. The story is only kept alive by foreign outlets like the BBC, which just released an hour-long documentary on this a couple months ago. Perhaps I'll return to this topic once I cover a series where male idol groups have more relevance, but as for Rise, I like to think rank 8 of her social link carries some link to blacklisting. Ami Suzuki was one of the top idols of the late 90s, and in 2001, she and her parents filed a lawsuit against her management agency, AG Communications. Ami wanted to terminate her contract after learning that multiple higher-ups were arrested on charges of tax evasion in the years prior. And though she eventually won the case, she was completely frozen out of the industry. All her CDs were pulled from shelves, her TV ads vanished overnight, she was removed from her upcoming starring role in a drama series, and no other label was willing to sign her. She did achieve some semblance of a comeback years later, but the initial blacklisting was a death blow to her popularity and reach. And this is considered a fortunate outcome compared to other blacklisted stars. All the agencies have an informal agreement to shut out anyone who defects to another company or tries to go independent. The Jimusho is an entirely closed system when compared to Western labels, meaning in Rise's case, she most definitely could kiss any kind of future role as a singer, dancer, or actress goodbye if rank 8 really did end up being her final chat with her manager. This was more of a problem back during P4's original release in 2008, since the rise of social media platforms has changed the landscape somewhat. But now it's about time we finally tackle Rise's social link in its entirety. Of all the social links, Rise's is the most straightforward exploration of the core Jungian ideas that have come to define these games. Not just regarding the shadow, ego, and persona, but also the tarot archetypes and the fool's journey as developed by Jung's followers. And those of you who've already watched my Arcana analyses on Persona 5 and 3 know how much I love this stuff. But before we can dive into all this overarching symbolism, we need to break down the actual events of this link first. So coming off her shadow boss fight, Rise acknowledges this erotic form in front of her, saying,
You, me, even Risette. They were all born from me. All of them are me.
Every action we take, every word we say, does reveal something about us. But none of those things, whether good or bad, is the sole thing that defines us. Though it's one thing to say this in the midst of a life and death moment, and another to live it out in your day-to-day life. She goes back to denying any connections to her entertainer persona in rank 3. But as much as she doesn't want to think about all this idol stuff, Risette is still a part of her. Not the entirety of her, but still a part. Mainly the one that loves the spotlight and attention. We've already covered the beach and beauty pageant moments in the last section, so now let's take a look at rank 6. She says, I could just inherit the tofu shop. I'm the main attraction now and can really make it thrive. Then in rank 7 she asks, you like having such a cute underclassman, right? I'm an ex-idol after all. Which all goes to show her idol persona is something she's still clinging on to. She's been tiptoeing this line of saying she's completely done with Risette, and yet she never takes any initiative to actually sever it, like sending in a resignation to her agency. She doesn't actually want to lose this part of her, which is why rank 8, the one where her manager announces he's moving on, is so crushing. This lets us segue to her relationship with Inoue-san. So Rise is so sick of Risette because she thinks no one sees the real her, right? But how much does someone need to know for it to count as, quote, knowing the real us? Or what do they need to know? If my friend and I have supported each other during our toughest health and familial struggles, yet don't share any of the same hobbies or interests, does she know less of me than the friend I made half a year ago who shares my lifelong love of video games and anime, but doesn't know anything about my private life? What is the real us? And how much of it can a single other person really see? So back to Inoue-san. Does he want Rise to be commercially successful? Of course, that's his job. But does this mean he doesn't care about her as a person? No! Both of these things can be true at the same time, just as the many Rises can coexist all at once. He does understand how difficult today's cult of personality world can be, and he's not only focused on Risette, he actually does take notice of Rise outside her stage persona, like how he's aware that the specific fans' letters have been an encouragement to her in tough times. On this note, I'd like to discuss Rise's impulsivity, as showcased when she suddenly blurts out she's marrying you after high school. She even brings it up again in rank 6 that, hey, maybe both of you really should follow through. Now if your response is, if you're serious, it catches her by surprise. And when we add on what those bystanders in Okina City say about how Kanami is plain and honest, while Risette is fake, they're kinda not wrong. To an extent, of course. Rise flawlessly employs crocodile tears when her lethal cooking isn't received well, showing how fake she has the capacity to be. With all this said, I wouldn't be surprised that Inoue-san is used to how Rise changes her mind on a whim. His constant reappearances may seem like hounding, but overall I see it as him just trying to make sure this is what Rise truly wants. The fact that he respects her choice in the end and only wishes her well says as much. That he does see the real her. As for Rise's perspective though, she spends a large chunk of the social link categorizing things in very black and white terms. Inoue-san has a daughter her age and has always treated her like family, but now that she's on hiatus, he's a stranger. He can't be worried about her since he only wants to see Risette back. The way Rise talks about her parents and home life early on gives the impression they're not a very close family. That her mom and dad don't even know what their own daughter's needs are at any given time. Rise says they'd only bombard her with questions about her hiatus, which is why she's gone to stay with her grandma instead. And the fact her relatives were the ones who sent in her audition to the talent agencies without even getting her permission first is a big yikes. When I consider all these things, it really elevates Inoue-san's concern in my view. Like he is this fatherly figure she doesn't actually have. Rise's third-tier persona rank has something important to say about our relationships with others in general. That there's no malice involved, but we end up hurting each other. Proper communication isn't always easy, right? Inoue didn't mean to make Rise feel unappreciated until it was too late. Nevertheless, withholding all those specifics and sticking to only vague praise of her skills played a hand in that. Meanwhile, Rise only assumed he cared solely about her idol persona, and not her as a person. Their intentions just skirted around each other even after working together for all those years. So yeah, oftentimes we hurt others by what we don't say, like when Rise refuses to apologize to the boys after the girls find out they were wrong about the hot spring schedule. She wasn't being intentionally cruel about it, yet it was still an inconsiderate, mean, and quite frankly, inexcusable thing to do, especially to your friends. Eventually, Rise does come full circle to what she already knew deep down since her dungeon. In rank 9 onwards, she accepts that there are various iterations of her, But the lessons we've learned from our unique lived experiences, our core values and morals, our purpose and what drives us, in other words, our overall sense of identity doesn't change. A lesson that allows us to segue into why this takeaway is so significant in context of Swiss psychologist Carl Jung and his followers' ideas. So the events in game already cover Jung's thoughts on the shadow and the ego, that it's unhealthy to be ruled solely by one or the other, and instead we must learn to integrate both, meaning all aspects of ourselves are important to our entirety. But our resulting persona isn't a singular fixed one, but a multifaceted one. This is a concept that followers of Jung indirectly fleshed out in two major ways. Firstly, by assigning the same archetypal roles Jung recognized across all cultures to the major arcana. And secondly, in popularizing the fool's journey, a metaphor for the journey of life every single one of us is on. Yep, we are all technically the fool of our own journeys. Think of it like we're all our own wild card, and depending on which parts of me I display, I might be the priestess to one person, but the hermit to someone else, and so on. Interestingly enough, we can somewhat ascribe Rise's background to the typical fool's journey, that she is encountering various tarot archetypes, learning from them, and becoming a more well-rounded person. Her confidence and cheerful attitude in P4 is a huge contrast to the shy girl who could only look at her feet, the one who felt stifled at home by her strict parents. At one point, Rise asks the protagonist if he feels like he's acting. And well, can any of us legitimately say we've never had to do this before? To get along in society, sometimes we have to adapt. The Persona 3 through 5 protags are all portrayed as being adept at either reading and or adapting to different kinds of people quickly. This helps them form bonds with others, which in turn strengthens their personas. Much like the protag, Rise also has great insight into what makes others tick. Her being scouted by talent agencies, but especially for acting roles, point to her having some natural affinity for this, since the first step to acting is identifying what makes someone who they are and understanding what drives them, right? She also mentions how she's met so many people via her work, and so knowing what idols do, like going on tons of TV talk shows, traveling all around Japan for events and meetups, surely she must have met and gotten a feel for all kinds of personalities. With that said, allow me to do a little more reaching than I already do, but I truly think someone of her background and talents is just the perfect navigator for this particular persona. Of the three Hashino games, Persona 4 focuses the most on relationships, both intra- and interpersonal. It has the most intimate setting, not only because it features the smallest town and cast, but also due to how the TV world and shadow bosses work. The latter means we see all of our party members directly confront their own shadow, the part of themselves they find most reprehensible. Yet the Midnight Channel isn't only influenced by the victims' thoughts of themselves, but also by how society views them. Like how our perception of Namatame after the Nanako fake-out influenced what we saw on the TV. P4 is also the first game to include social links with all the party members, so it's all of these things in tandem that, to me, emphasize P4's focus on understanding ourselves, other people, and our relationships to each other. On that note, this entire video has been about how modern idols thrive off the perceived building of relationships and trust with fans, and so when looking at Rise via the game's mechanics, we can see she is great at reading people. I mean, we are showing her shadow form our personas during that fight, right? And later, the scanning and subsequent OP attack suggests she's seen through our weaknesses. Similarly, the inability to land hits on her could suggest her various facades, essentially becoming unreadable. Remember, who is the real Rise? Then as a member of the party, Rise's insight is demonstrated in how her persona locates each victim, like Mitsuo and Naoto. We always need to get her some kind of info or insight into who the person is, something we collect via a brief investigation in town, and it's this that helps her put two and two together about the person and subsequently navigate through the fog, or the, quote, maze of relationships, as per Vanilla P4's opening. Her persona helps us find each boss shadow, aka the most intimate version of each victim that they don't want others to see or know. And I know we just went over how Rise struggles with this over her social link, but I think it symbolically says a lot that she's the one party member who understands there's multiple facets to the self beyond just our shadow and persona. Then right after, she's the only one who's able to fight immediately after confronting her shadow, helping us battle teddies in the TV world's fog without glasses. Rise's Arcana, the Lovers, just adds an additional fitting layer to all this, since it's one of the most relational cards in the tarot deck. It doesn't necessarily always refer to romantic love, but just the joys of forming a relationship with someone else in general. I'll eventually do an entire Arcana breakdown of the P4 cast in the same vein of my P5 and P3 series. But to wrap this up, the idol industry in Japan is honestly the beating heart of so much of the commentary centered on modern-day relationships. Like, entire generations at this point have grown up, perhaps even been raised by TV personalities and internet creators. Parasocial relationships, in other words. The focus on idols in Persona 4 and Persona 4 Dancing is so incredibly relevant given how these idols are surrounded by so many people, yet are often some of the loneliest people in the world. Rise said as much in her rank 7, and Kanami's experience echoes this when we see her always going back to an empty flat once her day is over. The Love Meets Bonds festival in P4D, which is based on the annual Tokyo Idol Festival, really strikes a chord with its name alone. So many idols feel like no one knows the real them, which leads us to our final major section. Alright, it's time we talk about parasocial relationships. You know, those one-sided relationships we form with the creatives we watch. You often end up learning a whole lot about them, all the while they don't know a single thing about you. I mean, hey, you guys sorta have one with me. Anyway, it's understandable why these relationships have gotten a bad rap over the years, considering the craziest outcomes have subjected creators and celebrities to death threats, stalkers, and assault. Hell, Rise herself briefly deals with a stalker in the game. Just this past decade, there have been 2 horrific attacks on Japanese idols. In 2014, 2 members of AKB48 were seriously injured when a fan attacked them with a handsaw at a handshake event. 2 years later, in 2016, Mayu Tomita was stabbed over 60 times by a fan-turned-stalker simply because she sent a gift he sent her back. She has lasting disabilities from this incident to this day. Now obviously, these results are awful. But does this mean there really are no redeemable qualities to these relationships? Well, I personally can't be grateful enough to them. And honestly, this all boils down to how we frame these relationships in our lives. With that said, Philip DeFranco had a fascinating guest on his show a couple months ago, Dr. Gail Stever. She's a professor who's been researching parasocial relationships for over 30 years, and she explained how they've actually been helpful stepping stones for many people. One example she mentioned was a woman whose husband had unfortunately passed away. But years later, she ended up forming a celebrity crush, which helped her realize she still had the capacity for romantic feelings, and so she got back into the dating game. Dr. Stever also mentioned how fans create and join fandoms and end up making lifelong friends, all thanks to a shared love of a certain creator, much like how we all have a shared love of the Persona games. We can also feel motivated by these creators' life stories or experiences, which sounds awfully similar to the fan Rise used to get letters from, right? This girl really resonated with Rise's experience of being friendless and bullied, and was inspired to put herself out there and make friends in her own life. The friend she eventually makes may seem a bit questionable, but overall the main takeaway is she did it. This girl got over that hurdle and made her first friend. As for me, I've developed such a different view and affinity towards Rise during my P4G replay last year. I first played this game in 2014, a time before I contracted transverse myelitis and started doing YouTube. While I didn't dislike any of the characters, Rise was definitely one of my least favorite of the cast. Now, those of you who have been around the channel for a long time may remember my video where I talked about how it was in large part thanks to some of my favorite YouTubers that I decided to take the plunge and start posting my own videos. They were discussing the irreplaceable friends they've made from the opportunities created on this platform, and at the time, I was feeling incredibly isolated, physically and mentally, from my peers due to my health. If you want to know more about this, by the way, you can check out the video in the cards. But yeah, I can't even begin to tell you how grateful I am that those creators shared their personal experiences with this, because otherwise I never would have met all these amazing people and made such great friends if it wasn't for my YouTube and streaming journey. Honestly, I can't fathom how people with severe chronic illness or disability even survived prior to the internet. How were you supposed to meet people when you don't even feel well enough to leave home? I made my own video about why I started YouTube a few years later, and to this day I'm still blown away by the comments that my story with transverse myelitis would resonate with so many folks. I'm really glad that it helps others who are in a similar situation as me feel less alone, in the same way other creators who are figuring out life with their illness or disability help me feel seen. Similarly, Rise truly comes to appreciate how she can be a source of encouragement to those who watch her as Risette. So, can parasocial relationships be bad? Sure they can. If you become attached to an unhealthy degree and/or use them to replace all real-life relationships, then yeah, they can be detrimental. And by the way, by real-life relationships, it doesn't have to be face-to-face. Depending on our circumstances, just putting in the same amount of back and forth interaction with online friends can be just as valuable. In other words, it mostly boils down to how intentionally you're trying to approach the relationship opportunities that come up. Throughout the events of P4D, Kanami and the other girls in her group realize that they want to put more effort into building the friendships they have with each other. There's precedence in real life, given how many former idols have shared about the cherished friendships they've made with the other girls in their respective groups. As a final note on this section, it's nice Rise doesn't take her fans' shift in loyalty to another idol personally, even if it is still disappointing. But I think her respect for this former fan of hers adds to the whole Rise encompassing the fool's journey vibe, since she essentially understands that this girl is on her own journey, just as she's on hers. I'm actually of the mind that Rise takes rejection from you really well if you turn down her romance flags in the social link. Her response for the rest of the rank is the exact same whether you choose to hug her or not. Remember, the Lover's Arcana appreciates relationships whether romantic or platonic. So sure, she'll always be a forward personality, but it's always struck me that despite what it might look like, that she's desperate for attention, when it really comes down to it, Rise takes rejection like a champ, giving the impression that she has internalized her worth deep down. In this concluding segment, I'd like to dive into how Rise is portrayed in the dancing game. I refuse to believe this wasn't intentional. That Risette's concept in the spin-off differs from when she sang True Story in Golden, a song that already existed in her lineup prior to the events of P4, or in other words, before she went through all that character growth in-game. If you notice Rise's main tracks in P4D, they are Pursuing My True Self and a remix of Arena Ultimax's Ending. Both songs are vocally more smooth and rich compared to True Story, and more sensual choreography-wise with the longer, more fluid movements, especially with dem hips. It gives a more mature air than the cheery pop that's the norm for Japanese idols. In other words, something more in tune with the Rise we've come to know in Inaba, someone who's naturally more sensuous and flirty. We can take this image a step further by comparing it to the sound and choreo of Kanami's P4D songs, like Shadow World for example. Not to mention the overall aesthetic of their respective outfits. I have no other way to describe it, but Rise goes for the sexier concept compared to Kanami's visor and kitchen apron inspired look. Kanami inhabits the more typical kawaii aesthetic of Japan's idol groups, something we actually see in Rise's True Story DLC, i.e. one of her older tracks, which has simpler and more jerky moves with cuter facial expressions and poses. By the way, I want to make it clear that neither style is inherently better, they are just different. Anyway, I like to think this means Rise's been given more creative freedom by her agency. We went over earlier how she's not a fan of the ditzy image, so her new appearance in dancing seems to encompass more of Rise's natural demeanor. Such a change is much easier said than done in real life, since many problems still exist thanks to the Jimusho, like forcing an image on their talents, as well as enforcing long work hours while maintaining a critical lack of support for their stars' mental health. But strides are being made as well, such as former idols launching their own groups in the hope of providing a less exploitative environment for these girls. Overall, I have really come to appreciate how Rise herself kinda embodies everything Persona 4 embraces aesthetically. The female-driven pop tracks and the bright yellow color scheme seem symbolic of femininity and what's normally deemed childish or immature by society, when the reality is, those are superficial and deeply prejudiced takes. So while some aspects of P4 indeed don't hold up, there's still a ton of commentary that was ahead of its time, like so much of what we discussed regarding Rise. The other ahead of its time media-related stuff will have to wait for another time though. But now I want to ask you, do you have a favorite idol group or artist? Whether they are K-pop or J-pop, let me know. I'd also love to hear what was the most shocking or just plain interesting thing you learned about the industry from this video. Also, please like this, share it, subscribe. I poured all my blood, sweat, and tears into this. And thank you to my patrons for making this possible and voting for Rise to get this video. Poll for the next P4 character analysis is currently up on Patreon. Be sure to check out all my other socials, and thanks especially to Big Clinky, Sam Bezjack, Francesco Santoyo Rego, M. Meownalin, Platinum Rose, Malcolm Lowry, Unholy Biscuit, Leviathan8685, Eden Korsef, Kevanik, Peter Shepard, and Andy.